What if everything we've been taught about the word ignorance is just completely backwards?
Oh, absolutely.
Right, because normally, like, if I asked you to define ignorance, you'd probably point to a failing school system or, a lack of access to books or maybe just a general detachment from world events.
Yeah, just not knowing things.
Exactly. But what if, to an entire nation, ignorance actually has absolutely nothing to do with what you don't know? What if true ignorance is something much more dangerous, like a collective, paralyzing reliance on hope in a system that is mathematically designed to keep you poor?
I mean, that is a profoundly uncomfortable redefinition because it takes something we universally celebrate as this great human virtue,
Hmm.
hope, and it exposes it as a critical vulnerability, an anesthetic, really.
It totally does. And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome back to the final act of this specific deep dive. For those of you who've been tracking with us, we spent our previous deep dives covering the first three sets of our sources, right?
Yeah, we were really immersed in the spiritual and philosophical side of things.
Right, the organizational architecture of the 30K Club. We looked at their highly secretive approach to elite wealth, the whole darkroom initiation, and this intense mandate they call sacred enterprise.
Which was fascinating on its own.
It was. But today, our mission is to step completely out of that abstract philosophical realm. We are focusing entirely on our fourth set of sources to ground those ideas in cold, hard, unyielding mathematics.
Okay, let's unpack this because the contrast here is wild.
Yeah, we really need to understand the foundational bedrock here. We're looking at the socioeconomic and political reality of Southern Africa that actually gave rise to the 30K Club in the first place.
Exactly.
And to do this, we're digging into a rigorous, data-driven regional report that culminates in a really fascinating piece from the sources titled Article 28, The Mathematics of False Hope.
I was actually looking at these numbers right before we started recording, and I honestly thought there was a typo. Like, the contrasts we are about to explore are almost impossible to wrap your head around. The numbers are staggering.
They really are. We are talking about a region, specifically the Southern African Development Community, or SADC, that is just overflowing with vast critical mineral wealth. And they have these highly advanced financial hubs in places like Johannesburg and Port Louis.
Right.
And the region's gross domestic product, its total economic footprint, was about $924.3 billion in 2019. And the projections show that by 2043, that GDP is going to absolutely explode to $2.1 trillion.
And on paper, if you're an investor looking at a spreadsheet, that sounds like an economic miracle. It sounds like an emerging market that's just about to enter a golden age.
Right, but then you look at the second column on that spreadsheet, over that exact same period, as the wealth literally more than doubles, the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty is projected to climb from 180.5 million to nearly 210 million.
Yeah.
I mean, if a corporation reported trillion-dollar record-breaking profits, but 90% of its employees were actively starving and filing for bankruptcy, you'd ask what is fundamentally broken. How does a region's wealth double while the actual human beings living there get demonstrably poorer?
What's fascinating here is to understand how that happens, you have to look at the demographic engine beneath the economy. The region is experiencing what demographers call a youth bulge.
A youth bulge, okay.
Yeah. Across the 10 interconnected nations highlighted in the report, so we're talking places like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, Mozambique, there are approximately 68.6 million young people.
Wow.
The youth account for roughly 32 to 33% of the entire population.
Wait, hold on. A massive incoming generation of young people, isn't that usually a good thing? I mean, that's a massive workforce. That's future consumers, innovators. How is a youth bulge a problem?
Well, it's a crossroads. Historically, if a country has the infrastructure, the education system, and most importantly, the job creation to absorb those young people, it becomes a massive demographic dividend. It just supercharges your economic productivity.
Makes sense.
But if you lack those mechanisms, it becomes a socioeconomic time bomb. And the data here points definitively to a bomb. In South Africa, the unemployment rate for youths age 15 to 24 is 60.9%.
Wait, seriously, more than 6 out of 10 young people can't find a job?
Yes, 6 out of 10. And it's not just South Africa. In Eswatini and Botswana, the NEET rates, and that stands for young people, not in education, employment, or crime. Training those hover around 38 to 39%.
So almost 4 out of 10 young people are just sitting there.
Basically, yeah.
How does a society not completely collapse under that weight? They are effectively locked out of the building before they even get to play the game.
I mean, the sources argue we shouldn't even use the word unemployment at that scale. because unemployment implies a temporary gap between jobs. This is economic exile. You have tens of millions of young people structurally barred from participating in the very economy that is generating that $2.1 trillion GDP.
Which brings up a critical point about how we actually measure prosperity. Because a $2 trillion GDP means absolutely nothing to a person trying to buy groceries on a Tuesday.
Exactly.
We always hear politicians throw around terms like the poverty line, but I want to make this real for you, the listener. What does it actually cost to stay alive in this region versus what the average person is actually bringing home? Because affordability is the ultimate metric of human dignity. If you can't afford to live, the GDP is irrelevant.
Affordability is the only metric that matters on the ground. So let's look at the actual mechanism of survival here. The World Bank sets the international extreme poverty line at $2.15 a day.
$2.15.
Right. And across this region, between 110 to 125 million people are surviving on somewhere between $1 and $2 a day. Now, let's translate that math into daily reality. $1 to $2 buys bare survival. It buys a single, basic starch, maybe a loaf of bread, or a portion of maize meal.
Just empty calories.
It mathematically cannot cover a bus ticket, electricity, medicine, or essential proteins for brain development.
Okay, so over 100 million people are trapped at that $2 ceiling. But what does the math say a person actually needs just to live a basic, dignified life?
Well, the locally established basic needs baskets, which basically calculate the absolute minimum cost to provide basic nutrition, shelter, and utilities for a family, they show that a household requires about $11 to $15 a day.
Wow.
So you have a mathematically established baseline for human dignity at $15, but the vast majority of the population is capped at $2. The discrepancy isn't just a gap, it's a canyon. People aren't living. They are aggressively mitigating starvation.
The sources give us such specific, devastating examples of this, too.
Yeah.
Like, let's talk about Zambia. More than 64% of their population lives on less than that $2.15 a day. But even if you were lucky enough to have a formal job, you are still drowning.
Oh, absolutely.
Like the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection tracks this stuff. For a family in Lusaka, a basic needs basket costs over 11,700 Zambian kwacha a month. But the average formal income is barely 7,700 kwacha. Even with a formal job, you make barely 2/3 of what it costs to just stay alive.
And we see the exact same structural trap in South Africa, which is, the most industrialized economy in the entire region. Let's look at a minimum wage worker there.
Okay.
Imagine getting your monthly paycheck. And before you have even bought a single grain of rice or a piece of fruit, nearly 60% of your income is instantly gone, just paying for the bus to get to work and the electricity to keep your lights on.
Just transportation and lights.
Yeah. You are left with a fraction of your income to feed your family. But a basic food basket costs significantly more than your entire original paycheck. The math literally does not work.
It's an impossible equation. You pay to get to work, you pay to turn on a light bulb, and you starve. And the state intervention completely fails to bridge the gap. The data points out that the South African Child Support Grant provides 580 Rand a month, but the actual cost to feed a child a basic nutritious diet is 964 Rand.
It's just not enough.
The state's safety net is 40% below the cost of basic nutrition.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanism of that specific deficit is terrifying when you map it out generationally.
What do you mean?
Well, if a child's nutritional needs are underfunded by 40% from birth, it guarantees physical and neurological stunting before they even reach a school classroom. The economic system is permanently locking them out of the formal economy by damaging their cognitive development from infancy. It is systemic mathematical deprivation.
That is incredibly dark. So if the masses are starving and people with full-time jobs can't even afford a basic basket of groceries, where is that $2.1 trillion of wealth actually going? How does a region generate trillions of dollars that completely bypasses the population?
It's all about the mechanism of extraction. The wealth goes strictly to the absolute apex of the pyramid. While you have 125 million people surviving on $1 a day, the region has a hyper-elite tier operating on $10,000 to $100,000 a day.
Per day?
Yes. The wealth leaves the ground, but it never touches the local economy. Like a mining corporation pulls lithium or diamonds out of the earth, the profits are routed through a holding company in Mauritius and traded in London or New York. The only money that stays behind is the absolute bare minimum paid to the manual laborers.
Here's where it gets really interesting because it's not that the wealth doesn't exist, it's just fiercely concentrated and immediately exported. The sources map this out clearly. There are over 122,000 millionaires across Africa.
Yeah.
South Africa alone hosts over 41,000 high net worth individuals, and it has a Gini coefficient of 0.81. For context, for anyone who doesn't know, the Gini coefficient measures inequality. A perfect 1.0 means one single person owns literally everything in the country.
Right, total monopoly.
Exactly. So South Africa sits at 7.81, making it mathematically the most unequal society on Earth. Namibia has thousands of millionaires, Angola has thousands, Botswana has thousands.
And this extreme concentration creates what economists call a dual economy, or, more bluntly, economic apartheid.
Walk me through that. What does a dual economy actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon?
It basically looks like two separate planets occupying the same geography.
Right.
The ultra-wealthy live in a completely privatized paradigm. They do not rely on the failing state. When the public electricity grid collapses, they have private solar arrays.
Right.
When the police force is underfunded, they use private security contractors. They use private health care. Their wealth is managed in offshore accounts. They are totally insulated from the decay around them.
They just bypass the country they live in.
Exactly. And when an economy functions like this, it sends a very clear, brutal message to the population. Human worth is strictly determined by proximity to capital. If you're in the bottom 90%, the globalized market views you simply as cheap labor or a surplus burden.
So if 90% of the population mathematically cannot afford to live, and they are watching this tiny elite fly over them in helicopters, why haven't they voted this system out of existence? We are talking about nations with democratic elections, parliaments, and voting rights. If the math is this broken, why hasn't democracy fixed it?
That is the exact question the socioeconomic report poses. And the answer lies in a mechanism called stomach politics.
Stomach politics. Okay, explain that.
When your electorate is operating at the absolute survival tier, like when they are literally short on caloric intake and defaulting on debt, their voting behavior is dictated by immediate material relief.
They can't think 5 years down the road.
No, they cannot afford the luxury of voting for long-term structural change. They vote for the food parcel delivered on Friday, they vote for the temporary grant, or the short-term agricultural input. Political parties know this, so they campaign on basic survival rather than economic emancipation.
It's like playing a game of Monopoly, where one player starts the game owning every single property on the board, and the rest of the players only get $2 every time they pass go. But the rent for a basic house is $15.
Right, you're just bleeding out.
And every 4 years, the players are allowed to hold this vicious, exhausting vote to decide who gets to be the banker. But voting for a new banker doesn't change the fact that the board is already owned by someone else.
That is a perfect mechanism to describe it. Because deep economic power, the power to distribute land, regulate monopolies, or capture resource wealth that resides outside the parliament. It sits in corporate boardrooms and foreign capital markets.
It's totally disconnected.
Yeah, and the regional examples in the source material highlight this perfectly.
Right.
Look at Botswana. Recently, the BDP, the party that ruled for 58 years since independence, they were completely wiped out at the polls by the UDC coalition. It was hailed globally as a massive democratic triumph.
A peaceful transfer of power.
Exactly. But the report argues the real test isn't the political win. The real test is whether this new government actually has the power to challenge the international diamond market structures that dictate their economy. Can they actually change the rules of the monopoly board while managing a youth population where nearly 40% are locked out of the system?
Right, and you contrast that peaceful transition with Mozambique. They had an election between the ruling Frelimo party and the opposition Podemos, and it resulted in violent nationwide protests.
Yeah, very different scenario.
But beneath the political clash, what is actually happening? Mozambique sits on massive offshore liquefied natural gas reserves, while 74.5% of its people live in extreme poverty. The political violence is ultimately a fight for the keys to the offshore treasury, while the masses are in the streets fighting to simply stay alive.
Even in South Africa, you see this.
Hmm.
The recent formation of a government of national unity, a GN, it stabilized their currency and boosted high-level business confidence.
That?
But at the grassroots level, average citizens are suffering up to 84,000 asset repossessions a year.
That's horrifying.
They're losing their cars and their homes because electricity costs have risen by 85% since 2020. So the political guard changed, the bankers swapped seats, but the micro-reality of the gross real didn't change at all.
Now, before we go any further into the implications of this, I want to take a quick, explicit pause here. Because as we navigate these intensely political realities across Southern Africa, we want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing any political party, right wing or left wing ideology, or the actions of any government mentioned.
Absolutely not.
Our goal is simply to impartially report the data, the mechanisms, and the ideas contained in the original source material. We're just the messengers here.
It's an important distinction to make, really, because the data we are analyzing isn't making a partisan argument. It's making a structural one. It argues that political power is completely subservient to economic power.
Which brings all these threads perfectly together to answer the core question we asked at the very beginning of this deep dive. Our whole mission today was to figure out what ignorance truly means to a nation operating under these conditions. And to answer that, we finally turned to Article 28 from the fourth source file.
Yes, Article 28, the mathematics of false hope.
So what does this all mean? The 30K Club looks at this unyielding math. The $2.1 trillion GDP existing right alongside 125 million people who can't afford a loaf of bread. They look at the youth demographic time bomb, the dual economy, and this illusion of stomach politics.
All of it.
And they conclude that ignorance is not a lack of schooling. Ignorance is the act of waiting for hope. It is the electorate standing in lines for hours, casting ballots, and praying that a corrupt, mathematically rigged system will suddenly decide to save them.
Which raises an important question, right? If hope is essentially an anesthetic that numbs you to the reality of your own systemic deprivation, what is the cure? How do you wake up?
Right.
And this is where the 30K Club's worldview synthesizes with the economic data. Again, maintaining our strict impartiality regarding their spiritual claims from the earlier sources, their proposed solution in this text is radical self-accountability and absolute economic dominance.
Yeah.
The group claims to provide the capital, the elite networking, and the ritual backing specifically to tear down these structural barriers. They view waiting for political change as a fatal error.
They argue that you mathematically cannot vote your way out of a system where the basic cost of living is 10 times the minimum wage.
You just can't.
The system isn't broken. That's the part that really messes with my head. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed to funnel wealth to the top while you are pacified by the hope of a better tomorrow. The 30K Club's ultimatum is brutal but clear. You must wield capital and build civilization yourself, or you will remain a permanent casualty of the status quo.
It's a very harsh reality check.
It is. And that brings us directly to you listening to this right now. Regardless of where you live or what your local economy looks like, the underlying principle of Article 28 asks a terrifying question. Are you actively shaping your economic reality? Are you building the infrastructure of your own life? Or have you surrendered your fate to systems, corporations, and politicians that actually profit from your stagnation? Are you just, hoping to be saved?
It is a profound shift in perspective to realize that the machinery of society is not inherently benevolent. Your survival requires you to become an architect of your own reality rather than a passive passenger hoping the train doesn't crash.
We have covered incredible ground today. We started with the sheer paradox of a $2.1 trillion GDP existing alongside a demographic time bomb of millions of young people locked in economic exile.
A massive contradiction.
We broke down the granular, painful reality of the extraction mechanism, how people try to survive on less than $2 a day when basic human dignity costs $15. We exposed the monopoly board illusion of stomach politics, where elections offer temporary relief rather than structural change.
Yeah.
And finally, we arrived at the stark ultimatum of the 30K Club, the mathematics of false hope, where ignorance is simply waiting for a rigged game to let you win.
And as we close out this series, I want to leave you with one final thought that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
If we accept the premise of this data that economic power, the simple ability to afford a dignified life, is the only true sovereign power, then what does that mean for the concept of the modern nation state?
Oh, wow.
If your borders, your constitution, and your ballots don't actually dictate your survival, but global capital and entrenched monopolies do, are we already living in a post-national world? A world where corporations and elite collectives are the actual governments and politicians are just the public relations department?
That is a thought that will keep you up at night. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Don't let hope be your anesthetic. Keep questioning the structures around you, build your own board, and we'll see you next time.